the educators at the lab, and I am here this morning with
live oysters. They are about 4 months old, and they were growing on these about 1 inch big. They were maybe when I put in a
and where'd you get the baby oysters?
So I got the baby oysters from the Auburn Shellfish Lab. So these are actually for a lot of tiles like this, but with about 10 oysters on each tile. So I prepared oysters in their tanks under controlled conditions, and they know how to induce oysters in their tanks in the water to form the oyster larvae, the oyster babies. They start looking for a place, and it's hard to control how many. I had some bets I gave them more tiles than I needed. And so maybe I should move into what's the big deal about oysters? Like, why do we care about them so much? And there's a lot of reasons we eat oysters. Really good for the environment, and that's with the way they feed. So oysters are filter feeders, and the way they, meaning they're getting their food from water, they package it into mucus, so excess nutrients are out of the water and sediments out of the water. That hard substrate is other oyster shell. Is really appealing if you're a fish trying to find a home and find a place to eat. Those reefs also protect us here on land. They can serve as a breakwater, as in oyster water, and then it's weaker when it hits the shore. So then you have less energy at the shore, you have less sediment being carried away, and then the shore more nature's natural breakers. So, lots of reasons to care about oysters. And that's just the natural stuff. I haven't even got into eating oysters and ship them a little bit quicker and more reliably. When you look at how many oysters are in the 1950s, that was sort of a peak in our landings. There's been a big decline since that peak, and doing so well. Well, why were there big declines in the first place? We do in our bays, like our dredging of ship channels and stuff, sort of.
And you also they do need to be.
That's a big point about oysters. You know, when we talk about a fish, oceans are bad for a fish, and oceans are bad for a fish, and swim in for conditions. Oysters can't do that. Instead, they're good. So oysters generally have a strategy of sit and wait for things to get better, which they're pretty good at, right? They
can close themselves and wait out this period when they're not submerged.
Yeah, but yeah, that's sort of if a reef is permanently buried under sediment from a huge dredging operation, or maybe
So you're talking about just some of the stressors that are impacting litany of stressors.
Oh yeah, and that's a bunch of what directly oiled, or the water quality deteriorated from that oil manages. Why not? And that sort of gets into things like, well, is water like? And I want to take a few minutes to talk about each of those. So water quality, I've been really familiar with the concept of temperature. I'm enjoying, it's been a nice break. Also been experiencing a heat wave, a marine heat wave. Water temperatures have been high as well. We were in the Fahrenheit.
In the water?
In the water.
Wow.
Yeah, and that is getting on, but it is stressful for them. And if you combine enough stressors,
processes, and how it's stressful, but it can also that might affect oysters.
Yeah, so oysters get sick. Just like we get sick. And so we're really keen to keep oysters in condition less likely to develop these diseases on the conditions. But these are how much it's raining, this range of salinities. They are a real estuary species. So it's not too, you have really, really intense rainfall. That's not good for oysters for their ability to their gills.
Let's move just a little bit over here.
Yeah, sure. And sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's more like you're the top of Mount Everest, hard to breathe. Oxygen. And they can go without much oxygen for quite a while. Temperature's really high, well, that increases their metabolism. That would increase their breathers. Oysters have a lot of natural predators. There are fish predators, like the bigger ones that you might mistake for a blue crab. I imagine these ones on my tiles, in theory, might be kind of vulnerable to even some of the small predator in our area, oysters. That's a really effective predator of oysters. Anyway, drills actually feed on oysters, but that's where the name comes from, in terms of how many oysters are in the water. Now, what's kind of what is salinity? So, oyster drills are more of a oceanic oysters are, so that occasional freshwater pulse, like a drought year where there's not a lot of rainfall, and these higher in an area than you.
Restoration. Mm-hmm. So a lot of information that as we all know, good
natural fishery resources, including oysters. So they're the ones generally tracking for the good of the environment. And they historically and to so-called relay oysters. Basically, that's picking up oysters up from one place and moving them to another place. So what does being in a reef entail? Well, on the first level, it involves hard substrate. They're not that picky, though. They'll settle on a lot of hard things. They'll settle on clamshell. They'll settle and scoop it into the water to make a mat of shell. Are there places in the bay that have better water quality or feel something different we could be doing when it's to building the reef? So, for instance, the low dissolved oxygen is in the deepest parts of the bay, furthest away from the surface. So if you have just a oyster shell that might be in the part of the water that has the worst oxygen, but on the other hand, if you built like a big tall pile of oyster shell, then oysters can settle on top of that pile closer to the surface, and that's more likely to have more oxygen because the oxygen is, most of it's actually coming from the air. So being close to the surface helps with that exchange, and maybe oysters can't grow on the bottom of that pile, but they can grow on the top of that pile. So thinking of ways we can redesign reefs, there's a lot of active research on that sort of question. And then there's other emerging ideas. Maybe we need more productive, safe oysters in the water to produce gametes and babies. So maybe we should grow oysters in our tanks, in our hatcheries, and then once they're big enough, plant them in the wild. There's an oyster gardening program where people who own a pier, they can get in contact and have oysters brought to them to grow out to a certain size, hanging off their pier. And then those oysters are later relocated to a reef. So maybe it's the vulnerable baby stage where they're having problems with the water quality or the predators. So if you can just get them big enough in a nice little nursery playground, then they're ready to go onto a real reef and help build out that population. Yeah, so that's sort of the general prongs of approach for how we restore oyster reefs, but a lot of it definitely benefits from us improving our science, improving our understanding of, well, which of these many reasons is killing or preventing new oysters from coming about, and then what can we do to fix that? And now that might be sort of a good segue to talk about how do we monitor oysters and how does that factor into some of the work I do? And I think now would be a good time to point out, I have something in the water over here, just off of our distal dock. So there is, from here it mostly looks like a PVC pole, and it is, and you can just barely see one ceramic tile, just like the ones I was showing earlier, covered in a lot of mud, but sort of fixed to that pole. In a moment I'll go grab it so we can take a look. But the idea is that we've set out tiles, ceramic tiles, in the water at different heights. The tide's high right now, so you can't see most of the tiles. But you can see one of those tiles is out of the water even at a high tide, whereas the lowest tile is in the water pretty much all the time, barring very unusual circumstances. And then we have tiles in the middle, get sort of an in-between amount of inundation. Inundation is just how much time are you in the water, how much time are you flooded. And I've explained how oysters, they can live in that intertidal, and that might actually be a good place to live because it again sort of goes back to their predators. So an oyster drill hates being out of the water. It can't stand it. It won't feed when it's out of the water. It'll try and go back into the water. But an oyster, of course, can be in the intertidal. And so that might be a good place for them to live because at least some of the time they're not getting eaten by oyster drills or crabs or other predators. Now, of course, there's a limit to that. We don't find oysters on our sidewalks or in our lawns. They don't grow on land. They have to be in the water sometimes. They have to feed and breathe when they're in the water. So the idea is there might be a sweet spot in the intertidal where they're in the water enough that they can grow and they won't die or dry out, but they're out of the water enough that they're safer from predators, if it is indeed predators that are what's limiting them. And we can try and figure out some of those questions using a setup like I have here. So I think now I'll go and actually retrieve the pole so that we can take a look at it.
Okay.
I'll be right back.
There are wild oysters growing on this shoreline riprap as well. So there are some adult oysters growing on this concrete here. And then there are some that, some oysters that have died, whose shells are still attached. That can be seen right over here. The purple or the brown, the dark spot on the oyster shell is a scar where the muscle, the animal's muscle, was attached to the shell, and the animal held the two shells together. And of course, oysters cannot leave their shells behind. Their shells grow with them as they grow. So empty oyster shells are sort of like the skeletal remains of an oyster. They don't have bones, but that is the remains of a dead oyster, not an indication that that oyster left the shell behind. I do see an oyster drill snail shell on these oysters over here. My guess would be that that has a hermit crab in it rather than the oyster drill snail. But that snail is fairly abundant in our coastal waters. Can I clip this back on you?
Yes, please. So that mostly worked. Usually this base pole actually stays in the water. It's a little overgrown because you can see we got a lot of things growing on this pole. including inside of the pole, we got a lot of barnacles. That's not very surprising. So barnacles are like oysters in that they have that planktonic larval stage where they're swimming around in the water before they settle in a place that's going to be their forever home. And very often barnacles are sort of quicker on the draw than the oysters are. And that means that they can actually be competitors for this substrate, where it might be hard for an oyster to find a place to settle and grow now that all these barnacles are here. And in fact, the larger barnacles can actually feed on the oyster larvae. So it's doubly bad for oysters trying to make a living over here. But it does, there is something interesting going on here. There is zonation, right? On some of these lower tiles, which are in the water pretty much all day, every day, we see bigger barnacles because that's their preferred growing environment. But when we see this top tile, or this top couple tiles, we see fewer barnacles, they're smaller, or they're generally absent, because that's the harsher environment for them to be baking in the sun, and they're not feeding while they're out of the water either. And that's,
Were these seeded with oysters when you put them in the water?
so these were not seeded. So this was my prototype. This was sort of proof of concept of how can I construct these poles and these tiles in a way that I can stick them at a particular elevation. And I was pretty pleased with how it worked out. And this is more or less what I've got in the field. But what I do have in the field, I have poles like this that didn't have any oyster spat on them, but I also have 12 poles that did have spat already on them. And those tell me different things. Mm-hmm. So what does this one tell us, sort of without oysters on it already? Well, this or something like this is a good way to measure how many oyster babies, how many larvae are in the water. What you got there?
It looks like an amphipod or a tiny, tiny mud crab.
Yeah, you pull these out, and in the field we see little crabs, we see little shrimp and amphipods, and a lot of things are making their living either on the tiles or on the things growing on the tiles. Becomes a little community, a little microcosm community of its own. It's a lot of fun, even if I'm mostly invested in looking for oysters. So the way you use this to look for larvae is, well, you're providing substrate for larvae to settle on. So if the oysters, like on the riprap around here, are producing a lot of larvae, we'd expect some of those larvae to find their way to these tiles. And then later we could pick up the tiles and voila, there's oysters on there. How did they get there? That was wild spawning. So I've yet to see oysters growing on these tiles, which is kind of interesting because we got a lot of live oysters around here. Mm-hmm. So that could mean a few things. It could mean that there's larvae, but they're not settling on these for some reason, or they're dying before I can notice them. Or it could mean that these oysters are not actually producing a lot of larvae. Maybe water conditions are not favorable for them. At this point, these tiles are pretty overgrown with barnacles, so maybe oysters have been trying to get on these tiles and they're finding there's no room, no vacancy.
How long have these been in the water?
So this prototype, I think I put it out spring of this year. So half a year now, more than 6 months.
And do you have some others in other locations?
Yes. Yeah, so this is the prototype. I have, for my actual experiment, I have 2 sites in Portersville Bay, so west of Dauphin Island. And I have a total of 24 poles where 12 of them are bare with no oyster spat on them, and 12 of them were seeded, so they had about 10 oyster spat on each tile. And So I explained I'm looking at the bare ones to see if I can find wild recruitment. I use the seeded ones though to see what happens to oysters once they're settled and see post-settlement mortality and growth. And so what happened is I put the poles out in late May, and I visited them 5 days later. And when I checked on them, already a lot of them had died in just 5 days. And since then, every time I go out, more and more of them have died. I've not noticed, well, I might have noticed a few new ones sort of growing on the sides of the tiles, but generally I've not seen a lot of new recruitment. I've seen a lot of post-settlement mortality, and I'm seeing some interesting trends depending on which of these tiles you're looking at. And so at both sites, the lower tiles had a lot of mortality. And that's pretty consistent with the idea that they're dying because something is eating them. And I do find a lot of oyster drills, those snails, on my tiles. I even find them on the unseeded tiles. Mm-hmm. They're pretty well abundant. But I also have seen them, I would pull up this tile and there would be a drill, and I pop up the drill and it's sitting on an oyster. Mm-hmm. It's definitely working on that oyster. So a lot of predation there. At one of my sites, I also see mortality on the very top tile, but less mortality on the sort of middle, the high middle tiles. Mm-hmm. And that also makes sense when you consider maybe this tile up here is too far out of the water, spends too much time in the sun.
Is this, would this right here be level with the, like the bottom, the substrate? Or is this above?
Actually not. So if I turn my pole, it's a little wonky right now because it's, there's like barnacles or something growing in this pipe, sort of stuck where it is. But if you can see, I have a bolt here going through this pipe. And the idea is that bolt is going to rest on the top of this pole. Mm-hmm. So I was very careful when I installed these poles and measuring them. I know to a pretty high degree of accuracy the height of these poles. I installed this bolt to compensate for that because what I wanted the middle of my pole to be about where I thought mean sea level was, sort of right in the middle of those tides. With the idea, so these tiles would be in the water most of the time. These would be out of water most of the time. This would be always in the water. This would be rarely in the water. Mm-hmm. Because I sort of wanted to find not just that there was a lower limit, which might be because of predators. I also wanted to see where that upper limit was, which would be because it's too much sun, it's not enough in water time. You know, and besides living or dying, you can also see a pattern in their growth. Of the oysters that are alive, they grew the slowest. They're still the smallest on these top tiles, and they're the bigger. They grow faster the further down you go, and that makes a lot of sense because when they're in the water, they can open up, they can feed, they can filter, they can get bigger. If they're spending a lot of time clamped up because they're out of the water, they can't grow and feed as well.
So there may be risks associated with the always being in the water, but there may also be benefits to the rate of growth.
Yeah, and that's an interesting trade-off, and that's why the idea of, well, there might be a sort of sweet spot in the middle. And for me, you know, my general interests are, how does that relate to when we build man-made breakwaters as part of our living shoreline restoration? I talked about how oysters can form a reef to protect the shoreline, and we're sort of trying to recreate that with a living shoreline. We're trying to protect the shoreline using natural materials, and we don't usually count on an oyster reef popping up all of a sudden. We build a big concrete structure or something like it, and then, well, we hope that concrete structure gets oysters growing on it. I'm finding that depending on the breakwater you look at, you don't get a whole lot. And one reason for that might be they might be too short. I'm finding breakwaters at one of my sites that are, compared to these tiles, they're like barely taller than this lower tile. So my point is, well, from my experiment, it seems like this is the best place to have oysters. So maybe we need our breakwaters to be at least this tall, and we'll get more oysters. I have the second site, though, where the breakwaters are pretty tall. They're taller than my poles are. And you do see a thin line of oysters. It's hard to see in the water, so I hesitate to tell you that there are no oysters down below. But I think my experiment's showing I'm probably right to tell you it's a thin line, as in below that line, it's probably too harsh of an environment, too many predators. That's my working hypothesis right now.
So you just kind of mentioned one of the challenges to monitoring in the wild, and so that would be observation. In our water, we live in an estuary, and we get a lot of sediment inflow from our extensive watershed, and so our water is often turbid with sediment, and so it's not just put on a snorkel or even use a GoPro and go and look for oysters, near the bottom of a breakwater.
Yeah, for sure.
So he's pulling these out of the water to look at them.
Yeah, that's a big motivation for my work. So Alabama MRD, when they
Marine Resources Division,
thank you. They are monitoring the wild population, to instruct the harvesters on where to go and how many to take. And my understanding is they do use divers. I think, my guess is they're not underwater counting oysters, because I think that's almost impossible. It's like chocolate milk sometimes. I think they're able to bring up shells that oysters might be attached to and count them out of the water. In other places with clear water, you can definitely send a diver or snorkeler down and do the assessment underwater, just count, or take a picture and count. We can't do that here. And my challenge with these breakwaters, I want to count how many oysters are growing on this breakwater, breakwater, but I usually can't. If it's really low and it's in the water, I can't see super well. And we have some ways around that, but with this isn't exactly on the breakwater, but it's very close to it. It's probably similar, predators are affecting this, and definitely the same water quality are affecting these oysters. So I think this is, an interesting, promising way to sort of help think about the living shoreline breakwater oyster question. Because, with this, I'm finding, okay, I'm not seeing a lot of new babies. I'm not seeing a lot of recruitment. That's a concern. Also, when the oysters are there, they seem to get eaten a lot. Maybe there's a certain height where they get eaten less. And yeah, I would recommend, let's try and build a breakwater that high. But that might not be enough, if there aren't wild recruits. So what can we do? We can continue to grow oysters here on land and move them to the breakwaters or these other reefs. But a lot of this, it might be conditions this year. Maybe next year it'll be heavy rainfall. The salinity will come down and the drills will be washed away, and it'll be a better year. And
it's a complex interplay of factors.
There's one take-home point from this conversation. I think that's it, right?
Well, and the more work that's done, the more we're able to refine, or bring that into resolution. So
right. I know ongoing research, oysters are being studied like everywhere in the country that have oysters around them, and probably more places. So there's a lot of work being done on this. Here at the Sea Lab, I'm aware of a few projects. We have one lab looking at multi-stressors. In our multi-stressor lab, they are subjecting oysters to high temperatures and low dissolved oxygen and figuring out when and how they die from that. So we can then make predictions of, well, we think the bay is going to look like this in how many years, and what does that mean for oysters? I see we're doing work like, I think, oyster drill tethering, maybe trying to figure out what will eat a drill and reduce their numbers that way. And there's one lab that's playing with the idea of growing oysters with thicker shells by introducing predator cues, as in if you grow an oyster in a tank that has oyster drills or crabs in it, they sort of sense, they can smell the predator. And this lab has shown that when they do and they grow under those conditions, the oysters will grow thicker shells, which help them, better against that crushing claw or that snail tongue.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. A lot of work being done because people are really invested in having a bay with oysters in the future.
They are incredibly ecologically and economically important. And so, like you mentioned, there is a strong motivation to understand, these ways that they're being impacted, and and what we might be able to do to mitigate that and to improve our restoration techniques. So, when do you when does the field portion of your project finish?
It's a good question. I've been thinking I would pull my tiles out of the water in the winter, but it might be actually interesting to leave them for longer. I do think I already have, most of the relevant, interesting data as far as here's where the oysters seem to be dying the quickest, right? I said just within 5 days, oysters were probably getting eaten, and that already tells me a lot about what's going on these breakwaters. But of course, when it comes to oyster restoration or breakwaters, it's not enough for oysters to live a few weeks or a few months, right? They need about a year to start producing gametes, to produce that next generation. But really, I think we want oysters to live year over year because they can get bigger, stronger, more resilient to water quality and predators. And the bigger ones are producing more gametes. And the bigger ones are the ones that are going to produce those big natural oyster reefs that we really want. So,
well, and as you mentioned, the environmental conditions naturally can vary widely from year to year. So, I've been here over 20 years and getting people out into the field and just kind of sort of observation during that time. I haven't done, research projects on oysters, but just, observing them out in the wild. There are years where we see no live oysters in our field sites. And then there are other years where the oysters are abundant. And there are years when we see lots of oyster drills on those oysters. And then there are other years where we don't see oyster drills on those oysters. So the environmental conditions can vary dramatically from year to year, impacting the populations of these oysters. So not only are there lots and lots of factors, as you mentioned, but also, it's variable over time scales and over the oysters' lives.
It's a complicated problem, but one of the proposed solutions to that, kind of straightforward. If conditions are unpredictable and changing a lot, the best thing you can do is grow oysters in as many places as we can, right? So if salinity is going up and down year to year, well, salinity is different in different parts of the bay. So what might be sort of marginal salinity this year might be in a high salinity year, in a real drought year. Maybe that's actually a good salinity for oysters next year. And maybe what was a good salinity this year is now too high next year, right?
So if someone wanted to get involved in that oyster gardening, where they grow oysters off their dock and kind of participate in this effort to increase oyster populations, do you have advice for how they might get started with that?
So there's resources online to connect with people. I'm sure they're always looking for more people with access to the water to help out with that. But if you don't have access to a pier and you want to get involved in helping oysters, well, one thing you can do is eat more oyster. It's actually these days, it's a pretty well-managed fishery, and it supports a lot of people who do care about conservation and the future of oysters, and funds goes towards research and conservation, and the hope is and idea is for it to be a sustainable fishery that benefits the environment as well as our stomachs. And there's a conservation fund to contribute to conservation research efforts, and consider patronizing restaurants that are involved in the oyster shell recycling program, right? So when you do eat oysters at a restaurant and they clear away your plate, you've left a bunch of oyster shells on that plate, and usually that might go in the garbage, but those shells are, right, a valuable resource. I've talked about how we use that to build substrate, build future reefs. And so there's a list available online of participating restaurants who take the time to organize, clean, and provide those shells. And those shells either make their way to oyster farmers or, to a stockpile of shells used for seeding oyster reefs.
Those are great tips. Thanks for making those recommendations. And as your project, as you get farther along with your research, just this will help contribute to the resolution of that big kind of murky puzzle that we're dealing with the oyster populations. So is there any kind of big picture that you'd like to leave folks with?
Oysters are incredible animals. They are ecosystem engineers. They are the seed for a lot of things we take for granted about how our bay works. And a lot of people are on high alert for their future and working real hard to make sure there's a future with oysters in it.
Well, thank you. Thanks for chatting with us today.
Thank you. It's fun.